1937, two best friends in their early 20s left a movie theater in Chicago and were never seen again. Their purses were found on their seats, their coats in the coat check, their dinner reservations still booked for later that evening. Police interviewed over 300 people, searched abandoned buildings, dragged the Chicago River, but found absolutely nothing. Then, 23 years later in 1960, a woman in California was watching television when she saw a news report about a local couple who had just died in a car accident. She froze. The couple looked exactly like her missing friends, same faces, same mannerisms, but aged appropriately. When investigators looked into it, they discovered the couple had appeared in California in 1938 with no past, no records, no history before that date, claiming to be siblings from back east. But the twisted truth wasn't about amnesia or kidnapping. It was about what those two friends had been running from and what they had done to ensure they could never be found. Before we dive into these twisted cases, leave us a comment with what time it is, where you are, and whether you can sleep after these stories. And if you're brave enough not to miss any of our weekly cases, subscribe to the channel now. Turn off the lights, turn up the volume, and let's unravel these mysteries that no one saw coming. Chicago, Illinois, December 18th, 1937. Margaret Wilson and Dorothy Hayes, both 22 years old, had been inseparable since childhood. They had grown up on the same street, attended the same schools, worked at the same department store downtown. They were the kind of friends that people assumed would eventually marry brothers and live next door to each other for the rest of their lives. On that Saturday evening, they told their families they were going to see a movie at the Palace Theatre, then having dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant. It was their weekly tradition, something they did every Saturday without fail. Their families expected them home by 11 o'clock. They never arrived. When Margaret's mother called Dorothy's house at midnight asking if the girls were there, both families immediately knew something was wrong. These were responsible young women who had never missed curfew, never caused worry. The fathers went to the restaurant first, where they learned the girls had never arrived for their 8 o'clock reservation. Then they went to the Palace Theatre, arriving just as the last show was letting out. The theatre manager remembered the girls. They had been regular customers, but he hadn't seen them that evening. The fathers convinced him to search the theatre anyway, and what they found in the balcony seats where Margaret and Dorothy always sat made their blood run cold. Both girls' purses were there, tucked under the seats, containing their wallets with money and identification still inside. Their coats were in the coat check. Their ticket stubs showed they had entered for the 7 o'clock showing. But somewhere between entering that theater and the movie ending, Margaret and Dorothy had simply vanished. Chicago police launched an immediate investigation. The movie had been a popular comedy that attracted a large Saturday night crowd. Over 300 people had been in the theater. Detectives interviewed every person they could identify, showing photographs of Margaret and Dorothy, asking if anyone had seen the girls leave, if anyone had seen them talking to someone, if anyone had noticed anything unusual. The responses were maddeningly unhelpful. Several people remembered seeing two young women matching their description, but no one remembered them leaving. No one saw them talk to strangers. No one witnessed anything out of the ordinary. It was as if the girls had been plucked out of their seats and spirited away, while everyone around them watched the screen. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police theorized kidnapping, possibly white slavery rings that were known to operate in Chicago at the time. They investigated whether the girls had secret boyfriends their families didn't know about, whether they had gambling debts or other troubles that might motivate disappearance. They searched abandoned buildings, interviewed known criminals, followed dozens of leads that went nowhere. The Chicago River was dragged in case the girls had been murdered and disposed of, but no bodies were found. Hundreds of reported sightings came in from across the country, but none proved legitimate. As weeks turned to months, the case grew cold, and the Wilson and Hayes families were left with the torturous uncertainty of not knowing whether their daughters were dead or alive. But there was something the families hadn't told police, something they thought was irrelevant, but would later prove to be the key to everything. Both Margaret and Dorothy had been dating men their families disapproved of. Margaret had been secretly seeing a married man named Robert Chen, a Chinese immigrant who worked at a laundry downtown. Dorothy had been involved with a woman named Sarah, a relationship that in 1937 Chicago was not just socially unacceptable, but potentially criminal. The families knew about these relationships and had been pressuring both girls to end them, threatening to cut them off financially, to report Robert to immigration authorities, to have Sarah arrested under morality laws. The girls had promised to end the relationships, but the families suspected they had continued to see their forbidden partners in secret. What the families didn't know was that Margaret and Dorothy had been planning for months to run away together, not with their partners, but with each other. Letters discovered decades later in a safety deposit box revealed the truth. Margaret and Dorothy weren't just best friends, they were in love with each other, had been for years. The relationships with Robert and Sarah had been covers, ways to deflect their families' suspicions while they figured out how to build a life together. In 1930s America, a same-sex relationship was impossible to live openly, but two single women sharing an apartment and working together would raise no eyebrows at all. They just needed to get far enough away that their families couldn't find them and force them to return. The movie theater disappearance had been carefully planned. They had deliberately left their purses and coats to make it look like foul play, to ensure police would search for them as victims rather than runaways. They had saved money for over a year, kept it hidden in a joint account at a bank where neither family did business. They had false identification already prepared, purchased from a forger they had found through Robert, who had experience with document falsification due to his immigration status. During the movie, they had simply stood up, walked out a side exit they had scouted previously, and disappeared into the Chicago night with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a carefully prepared escape plan. Margaret and Dorothy traveled by bus to California, taking an indirect route through several states, changing buses frequently, using their false names. When they arrived in Los Angeles in January 1938, they became Linda and Louise Carter, sisters from Pennsylvania, who had come west for opportunities. They found work, rented a small apartment, and began building the life they had dreamed of. To the outside world, they were devoted sisters who had only each other. To themselves, they were finally free to be together without fear or hiding. For 22 years, they lived quietly and happily, working ordinary jobs, making friends who never suspected their secret, building a life that was unremarkable in every way, except that it was built on a complete fabrication. The twist came in 1960, when both women were killed in a car accident on Highway 1 near Santa Barbara. They had been driving to San Francisco for a weekend trip when their car was struck by a drunk driver. Linda and Louise Carter died at the scene, and because they had no emergency contacts, no family listed in their documents, the state was preparing to handle their burial as unclaimed persons. But then, a neighbor from their apartment building saw a news report showing their photographs and recognized them. She contacted the television station to say what a tragedy it was that these two wonderful sisters had died so young. The news station ran a human interest follow-up, and that's when Margaret Wilson's younger sister, watching television in Chicago, saw faces she had thought she would never see again. Feeling that chill down your spine? If you're enjoying these mysteries, leave a like on the video to help us continue investigating cases like these. And in the comments, tell us if you've heard of these cases before or know any different theories. Subscribe so you don't miss the next mysteries. Now get ready, because what comes next will keep you up at night. The sister contacted Chicago police, who contacted Los Angeles authorities. Fingerprint comparison confirmed that Linda and Louise Carter were indeed Margaret Wilson and Dorothy Hayes. The safety deposit box key found among their possessions led to the discovery of letters, journals, and documents that told their whole story. The families learned that their daughters had been alive the entire time, living just a few states away, and had deliberately chosen to let them believe they were dead rather than face the consequences of living as they wanted. The grief of losing them in 1937 was compounded by the grief of learning they had been alive all along, and by the guilt of knowing that family pressure and societal prejudice had driven them to such desperate measures. The revelation sparked complex emotions. Some family members felt betrayed, angry that Margaret and Dorothy had put them through decades of suffering and uncertainty. Others felt profound sadness that the girls had felt they needed to fake their own deaths rather than trust their families with the truth. The case also revealed how extensive their planning had been, how much forethought and determination it had taken to pull off such a complete disappearance. They had known that being found would mean being separated, forced back into lives they didn't want, potentially committed to psychiatric institutions for treatment of what was then considered mental illness. Running away had been their only option for freedom, and they had executed it flawlessly. But Margaret and Dorothy weren't the only people who vanished together under twisted circumstances. Our second case takes us to England in 1974, where two people disappeared in a way that was far more sinister and far less voluntary than anyone initially realized. Suffolk, England, March 1974. Thomas Brennan and Susan Carter were co-workers at a textile factory in Ipswich. Thomas was 35, married with 2 children. Susan was 28, engaged to be married in the summer. They worked different shifts, but were friends, occasionally having lunch together on days when their schedules overlapped. On March 14th, both failed to show up for work. Their supervisor thought nothing of it at first. People called in sick. But when both remained absent the next day with no phone calls to explain, and when calls to their homes went unanswered, concern grew. Police were contacted to perform welfare checks. At Thomas's house, his wife and children were found dead, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heater. The scene was initially treated as a tragic accident, a family killed by a heating malfunction while they slept. But Thomas himself was nowhere to be found. At Susan's apartment, police found signs of a struggle, broken furniture, bloodstains, but no body and no Susan. Now, police had a mystery. Was Thomas a victim who had perhaps discovered his family dead and fled in traumatized shock? Or was something more sinister happening? The blood at Susan's apartment was tested and found to be Susan's type, suggesting she had been injured. But there wasn't enough blood to indicate fatal injury. As investigators dug deeper, the case became increasingly disturbing. Thomas's wife had taken out a large life insurance policy on herself and the children just 2 months before their deaths. Thomas was the beneficiary. Co-workers at the factory reported that Thomas and Susan had seemed closer than just friends lately, seen talking in corners, leaving together for lunch more frequently. Susan's fiancé mentioned that she had been distant recently, had talked about postponing the wedding, seemed troubled by something she wouldn't discuss. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was a picture no one wanted to see. The investigation revealed that the carbon monoxide poisoning of Thomas's family was not an accident. The heater had been deliberately tampered with, the ventilation blocked in a way that would cause deadly gas buildup. Thomas had the knowledge to do this. He had worked as a heating engineer before joining the factory. The timing of the life insurance policy was damning. And then police found letters hidden in Thomas's work locker, love letters between him and Susan, detailing plans to run away together, to start a new life somewhere far away, to be together without the complications of his family and her engagement. The letters spoke of needing money for their new start, of obstacles that needed to be removed, of doing whatever was necessary to be together. The twisted truth emerged slowly. Thomas had murdered his family to collect the insurance money and eliminate the obstacle to his relationship with Susan. But Susan, according to her letters, had been increasingly uncomfortable with the plan, had wanted to find another way, had threatened to go to police. The blood at her apartment told the rest of the story. Thomas had likely confronted Susan. They had fought, and he had either killed her or taken her by force. The question was where they were now and whether Susan was still alive. A massive manhunt was launched. Thomas's photograph was distributed across Europe. Airports and ports were alerted. But weeks passed with no credible sightings, no trace of either person, no body found. Then, 2 months after the disappearance, hikers in Scotland found a shallow grave in a remote area of the Highlands. The body inside was identified as Susan Carter. She had been strangled. Near her body was a suicide note in Thomas's handwriting, confessing to murdering his family and Susan, expressing remorse, stating that he planned to end his own life. But Thomas's body was never found. Police searched the surrounding area extensively, dragged nearby locks, searched caves and cliffs where someone might jump to their death. Nothing. Thomas Brennan had vanished, and whether he was dead by his own hand, as his note suggested, or alive and successfully evaded justice, remained unknown. The case took another twist in 1991, 17 years after the disappearance, when a man matching Thomas's description was spotted in Australia by a British expatriate who had followed the case when it was news. The man was using a different name, had a different appearance with a beard and different hair color, but the expatriate was certain it was Thomas Brennan. By the time police could investigate, the man had disappeared again. There have been occasional reported sightings over the years. In New Zealand, in Canada, in South Africa, places with large British expatriate communities where someone could blend in. But none have been confirmed. And whether Thomas is alive somewhere, living under a false identity for the past 50 years, or died in those Scottish Highlands in 1974, remains one of Britain's most frustrating unsolved cases. What makes these two cases of people who vanished together so twisted is how different the motivations and outcomes were. Margaret and Dorothy vanished to escape oppression and live authentically, creating a life together that was peaceful and happy until it was cut short by accident. Thomas and Susan's disappearance was built on murder, betrayal, and violence, ending with Susan dead and Thomas either dead or living as a fugitive. Both cases involved careful planning, false identities, and complete breaks with previous lives, but one was an act of love, while the other was an act of evil. And both cases left families devastated, not just by the loss of their loved ones, but by the betrayals and secrets that were revealed afterward. The Margaret and Dorothy case raises profound questions about the costs of societal prejudice. These two women felt they had to fake their deaths and traumatize their families rather than live openly as themselves. They spent 22 years looking over their shoulders, maintaining false identities, unable to contact anyone from their real lives. They built their happiness on a foundation of deception because the truth was unacceptable in their time. When their story finally came out in 1960, it sparked quiet discussions in some communities about whether the judgment and rejection they had fled might have been worse than the deception they had practiced. But in 1960s America, these discussions remained largely private, the topic still too controversial for public debate. The Thomas and Susan case, meanwhile, exposed how obsession can twist into violence. Thomas's supposed love for Susan motivated him to murder his entire family, including 2 innocent children. Susan's growing realization of what Thomas was capable of led to her own death. The case revealed that romantic obsession without moral boundaries is not love but possession, not devotion but control. And Thomas's probable escape and continued freedom, if he is indeed still alive, represents a failure of justice that haunts the families of his victims. His wife and children are buried and mourned, but Susan's family has the added torture of knowing her killer might be out there somewhere, living under an assumed name, perhaps even with a new family, having successfully escaped consequences for his crimes. Both cases also demonstrate how completely someone can vanish when they are determined enough. In the 1930s and 1970s, before digital records, facial recognition, DNA databases, and comprehensive tracking, it was possible to simply become someone else. You could get false documents, move to a new place, start fresh, and unless you drew attention to yourself, live indefinitely under your new identity. Margaret and Dorothy proved this could be done successfully for decades by ordinary people with no special skills or resources, just determination and careful planning. Thomas proved that even someone wanted for multiple murders could potentially disappear and evade international law enforcement for half a century. In our modern era of digital surveillance and biometric identification, such complete disappearances are much harder. But these cases remind us it wasn't always so. The families in both cases were left with complex legacies. Margaret and Dorothy's families had to reconcile the relief of finally knowing what happened with the pain of realizing their loved ones had chosen to let them suffer for over 2 decades. They had to confront their own role in creating an environment where 2 young women felt death was preferable to honesty. Thomas's family had to live with being related to a murderer, with the stigma and suspicion that brought. Susan's family had to grieve not just her death, but the betrayal of her participation, however reluctant, in a murder plot. None of these families got the closure they deserved. All were left with painful questions and complicated emotions. These cases continue to haunt us. If you're as disturbed as we are, leave a like, comment your theories, and share with anyone brave enough to listen. Explore our channel to learn about more unsolved mysteries and the darkest secrets in history. If you haven't subscribed yet, join the brave souls who follow our cases. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications so you don't miss any new cases. Leave your like if this video left you thinking, and share it with that friend who says they're not afraid of anything. Comments are open. Tell us what other disturbing cases you want us to investigate. Until next time, and sleep well if you can.